For most of human history, blue eyes did not exist. Your ancestors had already been living, hunting, raising children, and moving across the world for thousands upon thousands of generations before anyone carried the genetic change strongly associated with blue eyes today. And for most of that time, human eyes were dark, brown, deep brown, sometimes so dark they would have looked almost black from a distance. Then, somewhere thousands of years ago, something changed inside one ancient human lineage. Not the shape of the eye, not the pupil, not the way the eye worked. A tiny piece of DNA changed. And somehow that tiny change survived. It passed into children, then grandchildren, then entire populations. Until today, millions of people carry its descendants. But here is what makes the story genuinely strange. That mutation never created anything blue. There is no blue pigment inside a blue eye, none. So how did an ancient human with brown-eyed ancestors suddenly produce descendants with eyes that looked blue? And why did a mutation that began in one small population spread far enough that you can still see it thousands of years later? To understand that, we have to go much farther back. Back before blue eyes. Back before farming. Back before cities. Back to the humans living under the African sun. Early Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, where intense sunlight was part of everyday life. Our ancestors walked enormous distances looking for food and water. They hunted. They gathered plants. They carried children, they slept beneath open skies, and their bodies carried a pigment that had already become extremely important to human survival. Melanin. Melanin is the dark pigment responsible for much of the color in your skin, your hair, and your eyes. And inside the eye, melanin does something simple but important. It absorbs light. The colored part of your eye is called the iris. More melanin inside that iris usually means a darker eye. Less melanin means a lighter one. So for our early ancestors, dark eyes were not some unfinished version of blue eyes. They were the original condition, and they worked. Generation after generation, brown eyes remained. Then humans started moving. Small groups left Africa and spread into the Middle East. Others pushed farther into Asia. Some eventually reached Europe. This was not one giant march across a map. It happened over enormous stretches of time. A few families here, another population there, groups splitting apart, groups meeting again, people following animals, following coastlines, following rivers, escaping drought, surviving cold. And every time one group became separated from another, their genes began following slightly different paths. This matters because evolution does not sit down and design new traits. DNA is copied every generation, and occasionally copying produces a tiny difference. That difference is what we call a mutation. Movies have made the word sound dramatic. Most mutations are not. Sometimes it is simply one tiny change in the genetic code. Many disappear. Some do nothing noticeable, a few remain. And somewhere in the ancient populations living around Western Eurasia, one of those tiny changes affected human eye color. We do not know who carried it first. We do not know whether it appeared in a man or a woman. We do not know what their name was. We do not know what language they spoke. They may have spent their days hunting, gathering roots, making tools, carrying water, watching children beside a fire. To everyone around them, this would have been an ordinary human life. But inside their cells was something new. And eventually, in their descendants, that change could make the iris produce much less dark pigment. Now this is where the genetics finally matter. There are two names you need to know, OCA2 and HERC2. OCA2 is involved in controlling pigmentation. Think of it as part of the machinery responsible for how much melanin pigment cells produce. Nearby sits HERC2. And inside HERC2 is a region that can act almost like a switch controlling OCA2. The blue eye-associated mutation did not invent a new color. It turned pigment production down. Less activity, less melanin, less brown inside the iris. Your research source describes this HERC2-OCA2 relationship directly. The genetic change acts like a switch that reduces OCA2 activity and limits melanin production. But reducing brown pigment still does not explain blue. Because remember, there is no blue pigment. So where does the blue come from? Light. When light enters a heavily pigmented brown iris, much of it is absorbed by melanin. But remove much of that melanin and the behavior of light becomes visible. Light enters the iris, it scatters through the tissue, shorter wavelengths scatter back toward the observer more strongly. And your brain interprets that scattered light as blue. It is similar to the basic reason the sky appears blue. The sky is not painted blue. And neither is a blue iris. The color is being created by light interacting with structure. So the first blue-eyed humans were not producing a new blue substance. Their bodies had simply reduced enough brown pigment for something that had always been happening with light to suddenly become visible. That is the trick. Blue eyes were created by taking pigment away. But now we hit the much harder problem. Making one blue-eyed human is easy. Explaining millions of blue-eyed humans is not, because most mutations disappear. Imagine one person thousands of years ago carrying this new variant. If that person dies without children, the mutation ends. If their children do not inherit it, it ends. If the small population carrying it is wiped out by disease, starvation, conflict, or one brutal winter, it ends. For you to see blue eyes today, that tiny piece of DNA had to survive an absurd number of chances to disappear. And somehow it did. Researchers studying the genetics of blue-eyed people discovered that many share the same genetic switch. That is why the blue eye mutation became famous. The research summarized in your source points toward a common ancestral origin roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, associated with the HERC2-OCA2 region. Think about what that means. Somewhere in the ancient world was a population carrying a genetic change that almost nobody else on Earth had. One person passed it on, then another, and the trait began moving with people. This is where the ancient human story becomes more important than the eye itself, because those people did not stay in one place. Populations moved constantly. A successful hunting group expanded. A drought pushed another group away. People crossed mountains, followed rivers, mixed with neighboring populations, married into other groups, had children. Those children carried pieces of both populations inside them, and genes that once belonged to a tiny community could suddenly travel hundreds of kilometers, then thousands. No one understood what was happening. No one knew they were spreading an eye color mutation. They were simply surviving. But DNA was traveling with them, and in small ancient populations, something else can happen very quickly. Imagine a group of 50 people. Only a handful carry the light eye variant, but those few people happen to have many surviving children. 20 years later, the gene is more common. Those children have children. Another branch of the group migrates somewhere new. Suddenly, something that began rare can become common without providing any enormous survival advantage at all. That is the power of inheritance and chance. And there may have been another force involved: human attention. Picture an ancient community where nearly every person you have ever seen has dark brown eyes. Then someone appears with very light eyes. You notice immediately. Not because blue eyes are automatically better, because they are unusual. Rare traits stand out. And some researchers have suggested that unusual eye colors may have been influenced partly by mate choice. If people carrying a rare appearance were chosen as partners even slightly more often, generation after generation, that could help the trait spread. But this part is still debated. We cannot ask prehistoric humans who they found attractive, and your source does not establish one proven reason that blue eyes spread. So the safest explanation is probably not one dramatic cause. It was inheritance, population movement, chance, and possibly selection working together. But there is one explanation we can reject. Cold weather did not simply turn people's eyes blue. Weak sunlight did not enter someone's body and rewrite their DNA because they needed lighter eyes. Evolution does not work that way. The mutation appeared first. Then history decided whether it survived, and survive it did. Thousands of years passed. Hunter-gatherer populations moved through Europe and Western Asia. Some groups grew, some disappeared. Later, farming populations spread. People who had once lived separately began mixing. Then came still more migrations. New populations arrived, older populations were absorbed, and every time humans mixed, genes moved between them. The blue eye-associated variant kept traveling, parent to child, village to village, population to population. Eventually, it became extremely common in some regions while remaining rare in others, and that ancient unevenness is still visible today. There are populations where brown eyes overwhelmingly dominate. Others where blue, gray, and green eyes appear much more frequently. Not because humanity split into different kinds of people. Because our ancestors spent thousands of years living in different places, carrying different combinations of the same human genes. And those populations eventually began mixing again, which is why today you do not have to be standing anywhere near the region where the mutation first spread to see blue eyes. Humans crossed oceans. Empires moved populations. People migrated for work. Families crossed continents. Modern transportation connected populations that had once been separated for thousands of years. But the old DNA came with them. That is how an ancient mutation becomes a modern eye color. And here is another strange part. People often talk about a single blue-eye gene. It is more complicated than that. HERC2 and OCA2 are extremely important, but human eye color is influenced by multiple genes. That is why human eyes do not appear in two perfect categories, brown or blue. You get hazel, green, gray, blue-gray, light brown, dark brown, different rings, different patches, different amounts of pigment across the iris. But the blue-brown difference gives us one of the clearest windows into what happened. A tiny regulatory change reduced melanin. Less melanin changed how light behaved. That changed what another human saw when they looked into the eye. And then human history carried that effect forward. So think about how much had to happen for one pair of blue eyes to reach the modern world. The original mutation had to survive. Its carrier had to reproduce. Descendants had to survive. Their populations had to survive. Some had to migrate. Others had to mix. The variant had to pass through generation after generation without disappearing. Ice Age landscapes changed. Animals went extinct. Farming transformed human life. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Languages appeared and vanished. Kingdoms rose and collapsed. Entire populations moved across the map, and this tiny piece of DNA kept quietly passing from parent to child. Until today, thousands of years later, you can stand in a supermarket, classroom, airport, or city street and see blue eyes without finding them unusual at all. But they are unusual because buried inside that ordinary-looking human feature is the record of an ancient event, a mutation that appeared somewhere among people who knew nothing about genes, a mutation that survived population movements they could never have imagined, a mutation that traveled farther than the person who first carried it ever could. And after all of that, after thousands of years of inheritance, after migrations, after countless generations, after spreading into millions of humans, the strangest part is still the first one. There is nothing blue inside a blue eye. The mutation did not create blue. It reduced melanin. Light did the rest. So the next time you see blue eyes, you are not just looking at a color, you are looking at light passing through an ancient genetic change that survived thousands of years of human history. A tiny mutation, still staring back at us today.